ARE Podcast episode number 3.
Welcome to the ARE Podcast. Where it's all about encouraging and inspiring you today so you can fulfill your dream of becoming a licensed architect tomorrow. And now your host. He went to a Pink Floyd concert the night before his SATs. David Doucette.
Hello, and welcome back to another action-packed episode of the ARE Podcast. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Eric Corey Freed. Welcome.
Action-packed.
Full-on action-packed here.
I'm not getting out of this chair, I'll tell you that right now.
We are going to talk all about IDP and the 6 steps for IDP success. But before we do that...
This podcast is brought to you by ArchitectExamPrep.com, home of the ultimate hole enchilada. Is your brain ready?
All righty, just had to throw that stinger in here. So let's start our discussion of the 6 steps of the IDP process. Of course, IDP, a very important component in our path to licensure. So, Eric, I'm going to throw it over to you, and why don't you tell us what IDP actually is?
IDP is NCARB's intern development program. It's their way of tracking to make sure you've developed experience in all of the different practice areas and to know that you're then ready to take the ARE exam. When I did it 100 years ago, it was not required in every state. In fact, it was a bit of a unclear which states were going to do it. Now it's basically adopted practically everywhere. And even if you happen to be in a jurisdiction that doesn't adopt it, I think it's good practice just to do the IDP anyway. Actually, so that way it prepares you if you move in the future to another state. It kind of makes transferring your record a lot easier.
I see Lori in the background, by the way.
Don't mind her.
When I did it in, I started in 1995 in Massachusetts, and I remember at the time Massachusetts was one of the first states to do it. Although I'll read from NCARB's guide, it says, ultimately through the IDP, you will learn about the daily realities of architectural practice, acquire comprehensive experience in basic practice areas, explore specialized areas of practice, develop professional judgment, and refine your career goals. IDP is designed to help you realize those goals. So the other thing about IDP is it was created in the 1970s by NCARB and the AIA. So I don't know what happened, I guess, in the 80s with IDP, because I don't remember hearing much about it. It was really in the mid-90s when I started hearing about it.
Well, the 80s are such a blur anyway. So
maybe that's what it was. So yeah, I did it in Massachusetts, and I loved the whole process in terms of tracking the hours and, showing my boss and going to my boss saying, hey, I need more experience in this area. It really helped me. It was a great roadmap for this. So what we can do is we'll put a link in the show notes, but definitely make sure you download and review NCARB's Intern Development Program guidelines, which are dated November 2012. So, Eric, we're going to talk about 6 steps today. What are those 6 steps?
There are only 6 steps, 6 easy steps to IDP success. The first one is you establish your NCARB record. Second, you document your IDP eligibility date. Third, you identify who your IDP supervisor will be. This is somebody that you work with. Fourth, you identify your IDP mentor. This is someone that you don't work with, but someone hopefully that you look up to. And 5, you then document all your experience, which will take you literally years. And then we've added a 6th component, which is to be proactive. That you really need to take ownership of your career. It's your intern record, it's your experience, and you need to be the one that guides it and makes your supervisor aware if you're not getting experience in a certain area.
And we're going to go through each of those steps and break them down and talk a little more about each one. As a quick overview, IDP generally is going to run you about 3 years if you're on it and you're documenting your hours and all of that good stuff. So step number 1 is to simply establish the NCARB record. And we're going to do that by going to NCARB.org. They are the ones who administer IDP. They also administer the ARE process as well. So we're going to go to NCARB.org. We're going to go to the My NCARB section, and we're going to create a new account if we haven't done that yet. If we are a student or a recent graduate within 6 months, we can pay $100 to start, and then we'll pay $250 later when we request the authorization to test for the ARE. So basically, it's $350 to establish our council record, but we can start with $100 and then do the $250 later on. And that really is all there is to step 1, but it's a necessary step because it gets us in the system. It establishes our record for NCARB. So step 2, Eric, what's up for step 2?
Well, I will say for step 1, it's a painful step because it's $350, but at least NCARB is nice enough to give you the kind of split up the fee, pay $100 now, pay the $250 later, but only to current students and recent graduates. Step 2 is you document your eligibility date. This is the date after which you're then able to start racking up experience that contributes to IDP. It's an important date, and it's one that'll come back to haunt you if you mess it up. Because it's almost like football. It really comes down to a matter of inches at the end. You want to make sure that you've got every hour in all the categories you need, and missing 1 hour in one required category will cause you not to be able to complete your record until you do that. But part of this is dependent on your school. It's either determined by your IDP educator coordinator at your school or your IDP supervisor. And you need to satisfy your school's earning requirement before beginning IDP. So if, like, you went to Boston Architectural College, I teach there now, we require 3 years of work in order to start contributing to school, and you can't double dip. You can't count the experience you're counting towards school towards the experience you're counting towards IDP. Right,
and what happens with the BAC is typically it's a 6-year program. And you work for the whole 6 years at the BAC. You work during the day and you go to school at night, and on the weekends it's fully accredited, but it takes you a little longer to do it. And I believe the requirement is for the BAC that you need to satisfy 3 years of work experience for the BAC requirement. That's what it was at the time when I was there in the mid-90s, and I'm assuming that it's still the same now because it makes sense. Once we do that, then we can establish our NCARB record and start earning credits for IDP. And by the time you were done the BAC, you will have essentially completed IDP, which is what I did, which was a great program because it's 3 years for the school and then 3 years for IDP.
There are several schools that offer this type of professional. Drexel University in Philadelphia, for instance, has that same kind of deal. You go to school mostly at night. And the idea is that by the time you graduate, you've not only completed all the requirements for the architectural degree, but you've also then completed your IDP hours as well. But a lot of schools are the very traditional 4 and 2 or 5-year programs.
Yeah, I think most schools you're essentially going to start IDP after you graduate for the most part.
Right.
Which is kind of the 3-year internship that we've always heard about. That's where it comes from here. Okay, so then step 3, we're going to identify our IDP supervisor, and this is another important step because that's the one who's going to supervise us on a daily basis, number 1. And number 2, they're going to certify our work experience. So we're going to want to buy them a lot of beer or bring them a lot of flowers or whatever we need to do to bribe them to certify our work experience.
It needs to be a licensed architect at your firm, typically a licensed architect, but someone who can essentially vouch for the work that you've done. So, if you work at a large firm, this is not as hard because you might have multiple people to choose from. So pick somebody you like, and preferably who likes you. But if you work at a small one-man shop or something like that, you don't have a choice. It has to be then your one and only boss. But either way, supervisor is required.
Yeah, I think, and it's important, they do need to be a licensed architect. Under certain circumstances, it could be another professional from another discipline, maybe if you're working for a couple of years in a structural engineer's office. But I think in probably a medium or larger size firm, it's probably more likely than not going to be your project manager who you're working under, would be my guess.
No, they don't need to be. And plus, you get moved from project to project, so you don't always have the same project manager. But it needs to be somebody who can at least vouch for your experience. And remember, if you're both under the same firm, there's really no issue with them reviewing the work that you've done under other project managers. There's not a confidentiality issue or a privacy issue or an intellectual property issue. You're all employed, but you're both employed by the same company.
And the idea is our IDP supervisor, assuming we're still working at the same place, that would be one person who would continue during the term of us working at that place.
It also is kind of a good point to bring up. This is why you want to establish your IDP record early, because it's so much easier to document your experience while you're doing it than to go back 3 years later, 4 years later, and try to get it done. I've had friends that have tried to document past experience, and those firms have since closed. I had one friend, his supervisor had since passed away because it had been 4 years ago that he worked there. And so he got a little screwed at that point because he couldn't document any of that stuff, and none of that time that he spent working there counted.
And from what I understand too, NCARB has really, clamped down on their process of accepting documented work experience, and in fact, I don't believe they accept years back now. I want to say it has to be reported within the last 6 months, but I'm not 100% clear on that. But you can't go back 4 years, from what I understand now, and try and have this experience you counted 4 years ago now count.
Well, part of the beauty of the IDP program, what I really like about it is, in a way, it's all testing you to be a professional. And one way that you do that is with taking responsibility for your work, and another way is through learning how to communicate. And IDP really requires you to do both of those things and do them well. It's not hard to do. It's not hard to document your time. It's just a matter of doing it. And that's part of your path towards becoming a licensed professional.
Yeah, good point. And like in life, the more organized we are at whatever we're doing, we increase our chances of being more successful.
Exactly.
All right, so that's our IDP supervisors. So Eric, tell us about step number 4.
Step 4 is my favorite part. It's picking a mentor. And a mentor is someone you like, someone you trust, someone who could coach you and get you through the process, but they don't work in your firm. They work outside of your firm. In fact, it could be somebody you used to work with. It could be an old professor. I end up being a mentor to a lot of people because my students don't know who else to pick, so they pick me. But it's somebody hopefully that you could meet regularly, usually monthly. And we make it into a bit of a social issue. We'll go out to lunch once a month, and I make them pay, which is even nicer. But we go out once a month, and we're not just talking about what did you work on that month, but it's really a coaching situation. How's your career going? What career paths are you thinking about? Where do you want to be headed? How is the firm treating you? A lot of times we'll end up talking about are they ripe for promotion and why, and how to. I'm giving them advice how to approach their boss with asking for a raise. So it's a great relationship to have, and hopefully one that you would keep for long after you're done with IDP.
Yeah, and I think the beauty about the mentor and the difference between the IDP supervisor is the mentor does not work in your office, and they can't work in your office, and they can take a step back and help you with your career goals. So it's not just about the project you're working on, it's about your career goals, your path, And oftentimes, is the job you're working in, or is the firm you're working in, is it right for you? And that's what the IDP mentor can help you with.
The one thing is the mentor also has to be a licensed architect. It can be, but you can be a licensed architect in any state. So, for instance, I'm in California. I've mentored students in Massachusetts. We meet by Skype, but because I'm licensed in some state, it doesn't have to be the same state as you.
And then step number 5 is document experience, which all of these steps are actually important because you kind of can't do one without the other. But step number 5 is where we really document all of our experience. And as we were just talking about, it's best to document it as you go. And I believe NCARB doesn't allow you to retroactively seek back a few years now. I want to say it's 6 months, but don't quote me on that. We'll check that out, and that'll be a soon-to-be blog post about that, because that would be good info to know. But so we have 2 types of experience. We have the Type A, which is the practice of architecture, and we need 1,860 hours minimum. And then we have our Type O, which is other work settings, and that is also 1,860 hours maximum. And then we have Type S, supplemental experience. So total hours, 5,600 hours of IDP experience, which equates to roughly 3 years if you're working full-time. And the core hours are 3,740 core hours. And then there's 1,860 hours, which can be any experience, including the supplemental experience opportunities, which those are opportunities that we can take advantage of even if we're not employed. And you can find more information about that in the NCARB guidelines. So
one of the beauties of the supplemental is, and what I like about it is that if you're volunteering for a nonprofit that's in the building world, let's say you're on a committee for the U.S. Green Building Council in your area, or you're working with Habitat for Humanity or Architecture for Humanity, or volunteering in any of those ways, even if you find yourself unemployed, you can still start to whittle down some of those 5,600 hours. I mean, not all through supplemental, but at least a good portion. I think of this as the Shawshank Redemption model. 5,600 hours just seems so daunting, but with a little spoon, you chip away at it every day, and eventually you find yourself married to Susan Sarandon.
That was actually Clint Eastwood did that in Escape from Alcatraz, where he chipped
exactly.
away,
And then you make a paper mache head of yourself.
Exactly, and they knock it out of bed, and oh my God, he's gone.
He's gone, right.
Now we're dating ourselves. But I think that movie was actually before we were born, so there you go. I'm pretty sure it was. All right, so our experience categories. We have pre-design, design, project management, and practice management. So those are our 4 categories of experience, and pre-design, which I think is probably the one that might be most difficult to fulfill, because that's where we get into programming, site building analysis, project cost and feasibility, and planning and zoning regulations. That kind of work is typically done in the I guess the higher up of the firm, people who have a lot of experience doing this stuff. So I feel like pre-design is probably going to be the one that's hardest to fulfill.
That's one that my IDP people that I'm mentoring, that's when they complain about the most, that they don't have any hours in, because they're not in those meetings. They're junior people at their firm, so they don't get to have the programming deals, the programming meetings. They don't get to be in with the clients and help develop the programming documents. And part of that is on them. Part of that is that, if they've been put into a corner and they're doing construction documents all day and they're on Revit all day, part is that they have a responsibility to speak up and say, hey, boss, I need to get some hours in this. Is there any way I can sit in on this meeting? Is there any way I can work on this part? Give me an opportunity to show what I can do.
Right, and I think that's what is cool about this IDP process, because it basically gives, us interns leverage. because, we're just out of architecture school, or we're in our first 3 years of working in a firm. There's a lot to learn. And we quickly learn that the stuff we learn in architecture school may not necessarily really apply too much to the real world. But it gives us leverage to say to our boss, like you just said, Eric, like, I need to get experience in this. I need to come to a job meeting. And I think it's just great leverage for us to be able to do that.
And also, it's another reason why it's one of the reasons why IDP exists, but it also is another reason why you want to document as you go. You don't want to fall behind, because then you'll know instantly, of these 4 major experience categories, and there's 17 areas under those 4 categories. What areas am I light in? Everybody's typically very heavy in the construction documents phase, because that's what most people end up doing. And racking up more hours in construction documents is not going to help you. If anything, it's a waste of time, because you're not going to get any extra credit for having double the amount of construction document hours. So they're very specific as what's required in each category. And so have a very frank conversation with your boss and your project manager about how do I get involved? How do I get to do this? One other area that is also not covered well is the practice management, writing contracts, doing invoicing. A lot of interns don't get exposure to that at all, and they find it's hard to do that. And IDP is a good excuse for you to get in there and see how the business is operating.
Yeah, that's category 4, which we're not there yet.
Oh, sorry. You're so strict.
So category 2 is design, so schematic design, engineering systems, construction costs, codes and regulations, design development, construction documents, and material selection and specification. So as you were just saying, this is probably the easiest category to fulfill, but there's a lot of subcategories in this category. So we want to make sure we're not just doing construction documents, which is the most, 1,200 hours. I mean, that's the most in any category. But that's likely where we're going to spend most of our time, which is why we need to be proactive and make sure we're getting schematic design and we're getting engineering systems experience.
A lot of interns complain that they have trouble getting construction cost experience. Part of that might be their firm. If they're at a firm that's doing mostly design end stuff, you're not going to see a lot of price schedules pass under your desk. Here's an opportunity where you could potentially leverage some of your supplemental experience, or work with the contractors working with your firm and ask to be included on that, so you can navigate your own course and gain that experience that you need.
That's a good idea. It's actually a great idea, because I think if there was one area that practicing architects are weakest in, it would be construction costs, and just having the knowledge of what things cost, because there's always cost overruns, and a lot of times it's not our fault. I mean, clients do add things, but I think we could certainly be better at educating the client and being more realistic up front on what things are potentially going to cost. Category 3, what do we have in category 3?
Category 3 is project management. This is bidding and contract negotiation. It's construction administration. So if you're doing RFIs or requests for information from contractors, it's a great way to get experience and rack up those hours quickly. It's also construction phase observation. This is a category a lot of interns tell me they want more of. They want to be on a job site. They want to see them, tying the rebar together, putting the formwork in place, all that juicy, fun stuff, and they have trouble getting it. And this is where, again, you need to stand up for yourself and tell your boss, listen, I know I know it's easy to put me in front of a computer and have me do Revit or 3D models all day, but I need to see this stuff. And not only is it good for your IDP, you need to see this stuff so you can pass the exam. If you're, when you go to take several parts of the exam, if you haven't been on a job site and you don't have those images in your head, you're going to have a harder time studying than without it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, category 3 is probably the most, in some respects, the most fun. I've always enjoyed going to the construction site and the job site. And I remember, like, the first time you start going, you're like, wow. Like, what I drew on paper, it's like, this is what it looks like. And, it's interesting to think of these categories in terms of, we have, let's say we were on our 3-year path to complete IDP. Category 3, we're probably not going to be doing in our first year at a firm. We're probably going to be doing mostly Category 2 stuff, and once we put our time in on construction documents and we develop a relationship with our PM or somebody else in the firm who can make decisions on whether we're going to the job site or not, then they're more likely to say, hey, you know what, why don't you come to the job site with me? Why don't you come to this meeting? So it's kind of building that relationship before we get introduced into Category 3 stuff. There's two things kind of working against the interns at this point. One is they tend to be shy because they're young, they're inexperienced, especially if they're new to the firm. You can't be shy with IDP. You need to speak up and say, listen, I need this experience. I want it. I need to see it. And the second thing is that, interns tend to be great at CAD and 3D modeling, so they get pigeonholed and stuck on that. And it's very profitable for a firm to just, pay you $20 an hour and then bill you out at 85. So kind of keep that in mind. Keep in mind that there's this machinery at work, and you're trying to break out of that. Nobody's gonna voluntarily come and say, "Hey, kid, I like the cut of your jib, and I think that I think that you should be on a job site right now, doing construction observation." That doesn't happen. It's like waiting to be discovered. Yeah, you're not gonna be in the soda shop, the soda fountain, and be discovered. I mean, you really need to take responsibility for it and push your, be a little don't be a jerk, but be somewhat pushy and aggressive about it. All right, now Category 4, which you sort of talked about, but now that we're talking about this in order, I'm going to throw Category 4 back at you. Category 4 is practice management. This is business operations and leadership and service. This is a tough one because some firms don't want their interns to know how the firm's operating. So they don't want you to see the financials or how invoicing is handled or how reimbursables are done or how insurance is covered. So here's one where you really have to, kind of pester your way and ask. But when you ask, it's also an opportunity for you to show value to your boss. Boss, do you enjoy doing invoices? No? Well, here, let me help you and show me along the way. You're paying me. Let me be of value. Let me be of service to you. Because most principals of firms hate the operations stuff. Most principals of firms aren't doing a whole lot of designing these days. They're running the firm. They're doing the invoice. They're getting new work. They're out there marketing. They're doing, all these things we actually don't learn in architecture school. So yeah, if you can find somebody who would want help with that, which I'm sure that they would if the right person was to approach them. Yeah, put yourself in your boss's shoes, right? They're doing this stuff because they think that they think nobody else can, and they also think that they can't afford to pay someone else to do it. At larger firms, they have accounting departments and so forth, but at a mid-sized firm, it's probably the principals that are pushing out every invoice and signing, filling out each contract. And you need to see how contracts are done. And if you expect to pass any of the AIA contract sections on the ARE exam, you're going to need to know about this practice management section. And as we talked about before we hit the record button for probably the 6th time here, firms in general are pretty supportive of the IDP process, which is good. Yes. Yeah. Firms are getting much better at it too. They're encouraging their staff to do IDP. Sometimes they're paying for the exams. I've even heard a rare case of them paying for the NCARB record to be established, which is amazing. And it's advantageous for the firm as well to have licensed architects on staff. Yeah, remember, the more licensed architects a firm has on staff, the better they look to their potential client's eyes, and the better they look on a proposal when they say we've got 34 licensed architects. Yeah, so it's a win-win situation. All right, before we hit step 6.
Like what you hear? Show the love by giving us a review on iTunes.
All right, yeah, we would absolutely love a rating and a review on iTunes. Let us know how we're doing. Help us spread the word here in episode number 3. So step 6 we call be proactive, and we touched on this a little bit as we've gone through the other 5 steps previous to this. And this is in my mind, this is the most important one. Obviously, the previous 5 steps are very important. We can't do one without the other, but this is the one that is really going to help you with the IDP process, but it's also going to help you with your career, with your young career as an architect, and can really set the foundation for what you experience in the future. So the first one I will touch on is don't get pigeonholed. And Eric, you already mentioned that, and that's a good point, because what'll happen, or what could happen, not all firms, but certainly some firms will find out that you're really good at a particular thing, whether it's 3D rendering or contract drawings or whatever it is. And especially if you're really good and they find out you're really good, you are going to be the go-to person to do all of that 3D work. And it's happened in the past where people 3 or 4 years go by and they're still doing the same thing.
It's like a blessing and a curse to be great at something. If you're, I've seen people that are just incredible. They're incredible with 3D Studio Max. And I want to say to them, don't tell anybody. Keep it secret.
Dial it back a bit.
Yeah, you're making the rest of us look bad. But don't do it because it's so easy to get pigeonholed. Remember, the principal's goal is to maximize the firm. It's really to put you in a place where you can be the most productive. If you happen to be awesome at picking up red lines, well, that's all they're going to want you to do, and it's going to be up to you to show them, hey, I'm good at a lot of things. Just let me show you. And here's also a good example of where you can balance volunteer opportunities with your professional practice. So, for example, let's say you go do work for Habitat for Humanity on the weekends. It gives you a chance to be on a job site, to get familiar with construction methods, and then you could then take that back to the office and say, well, on our Habitat house last weekend, we saw this issue, and this issue, and I think it's something that I'm noticing on our projects. And so you're able to gain experience as a volunteer and then apply it to your real work, and then use that as a way to pivot your boss's mind into letting you work on these other experience areas.
Yeah, I think if you can be proactive and show your boss you're motivated, because obviously we want our boss's approval. We want to do well. So I certainly don't want people to think that they don't want to excel at their job for fear of being stuck in that one position. But we want to excel, in all of the areas. And bosses will see that. I've been a boss, I've had employees, and you can pretty quickly gauge, who's got the motivation, who's got the drive, who's going to be the pet, and who's not. And so I would encourage you to be the pet, and be proactive as you do that. Now, I will say, in terms of commercial versus residential experience, the ARE is largely based on commercial experience. Most of the work out there is commercial experience. There's obviously residential work. Residential work seems to be more tied to, I guess, the smaller firms. Of course, larger firms do some residential work, but a lot of the smaller firms, sole proprietors, they specialize in residential. It's a completely different skill set between commercial and residential. And I guess, Eric, what would you say in terms of, if I'm looking for my first job, or maybe I want my second job, just touch on, I guess, the commercial firm versus the residential firm in terms of IDP.
Well, a commercial firm typically is going to be larger, as you say, but with the residential firm, the kind of bittersweet irony is that in a residential firm, because they tend to be smaller, and because these projects tend to be more intimate, in a residential firm, you'll go through all the phases, right? You'll see the client walk in the door, you'll go through the contract thing, you'll go through pre-design, programming, schematic design, and all the way through construction and observation. In fact, at a residential firm, you'll go into the grand opening party that they have, when the house is completed. So the irony is, in a residential practice, you'll never see a concrete slurry wall. You'll probably never see a concrete pile being driven. But on the other hand, you'll get more exposure to all the phases of practice. So it's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword. But in a commercial firm, you might only work on ADA bathrooms, and you might work on those for 3 years, and that might be all you work on, and you'll be damn good at ADA bathrooms at that point. But you won't be able to touch on much of anything else.
That your dogs and not mine.
Don't mind that.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. And, I think of course, if you're following your IDP, if you're tracking your IDP, then you don't have to worry about getting pigeonholed, because IDP is your roadmap. And again, that's your leverage to go to your boss and say, I need more experience in this. I was lucky enough, which I'll say, I think in our first few years out of architecture school, we don't know what we want to do. We're trying to figure out. I don't think we should necessarily decide either way. I think we should get as much experience as we can. So whether we get a commercial job or residential job, I think they say, you shouldn't switch jobs less than every 2 years, because that doesn't start to look good on your resume. So definitely, I encourage you to get the experience. What I did, I was fortunate enough. I was hired by an architect, Lee Hohenshaw, may he rest in peace, in Boston, and as my second job at the BAC. And I worked for him for 5 years and in Boston, and it was all commercial. Majority of it was probably tenant fit out. We did do some new construction, but it was a 15-person firm, and he was the only licensed architect, and all the other people were sort of designers but not licensed architects. So he liked me. We had a great interview, and I was able very early on to get a well-rounded experience level. I would say within the first year and a half, I was going to job meetings with him and doing meeting minutes, and so I got to really see the full range of a project, which has helped me today. Now, with that said, we weren't designing anything special. We weren't designing anything. We weren't making any sort of architectural statements or any of that stuff. But I really learned how to run a project and project management and all that. So there's going to be trade-offs in whichever job we take. I will say it's highly unlikely you're going to get a design position right out of school. Those are usually saved for people who've been in a firm for a long time.
Well, and let's say you do, the other people will hate you for it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So I had, I was still in school. I was working at a firm. These hours were counting towards IDP because I was in my fourth and fifth year at Temple, and I was very proactive. I knew what I wanted to work on. I knew what to gain experience in. I wanted to get experience in every category. I was a very nerdy, ambitious kid. And I was thrown on CDs. I was thrown on design stuff. And as soon as I was put on design, the other guys at the firm started treating me differently.
Totally. You're a threat.
It was weird because they were stuck doing, they were managing projects. They were doing CDs all day. They hated it. And here I was, this young kid suddenly getting to do design sketches and concepts for a client. And they were like, why the hell does he get to do? Like, they think that there's this process of seniority, and what they fail to realize, and this is probably a good topic for another podcast, is that there are people that are on a production track and there are people that are on a design track. And you're the one that communicates that to the world. I wanted to be on a design track, and my personality is very much on a design track. These project managers who were mad at me for getting to do sketches for the client, they were very much on a production track. They were great at production. They were able to crank out 12 projects in a week or whatever. And they still held this dream that one day they would get discovered and put on design, and it just doesn't work that way.
It is interesting, and it, I guess, is a topic for another episode, but not everybody in the architecture firm will be on the architect track. There'll be people there who just love drafting, and they'll be drafters, and God love them, because we need people like that. We need people to consistently crank out these designs. So yeah, the personalities and all of that, it's another show topic. But being well-rounded, okay, so we talked about that. speaking of staying away from office politics, for as hard as that can be sometimes, for exactly what you just said, especially if you're going in there and you're being proactive, without being an egoist, but if you're proactive, you're probably going to piss one or two people off, and you can't let that bother you. And what matters is your boss and your supervisor.
Yeah, and the crazy part is that you'll meet people in your firm that will be so nice to you to your face, and then you will walk into the print room and overhear them talking badly about you. It's a very weird experience, and it's like they've seen one too many episodes of Melrose Place or something, and
right.
and they're just trying to get ahead. They think they won't think anything of bad mouthing you to make themselves look better. But I had a boss who I was worried about it, and I went to him and talked to him about it. And he said the best thing ever, which is, he said, if I hear anybody talking badly about somebody else, it just reflects poorly on them.
Right.
So you want to be, part of this is IDP is trying to make you into the professional that you're destined to be. And part of that is not getting sucked into these little childish, sophomoric games of playing politics at all. You want to be respectful to your coworkers. You want to be polite to everybody. You don't want to speak poorly about anybody, even though there are probably some big jerks in your office that it's easy to. Never say anything out loud in your office that someone could overhear. That's kind of a general rule of thumb I found.
Right. And you want to do all of those things you just mentioned, but still be assertive, like still be proactive. Like, don't just become shy and cower. Like, you still want to voice your opinion. You want to watch out for yourself, because you're the only one who is going to advance your career.
Exactly. Yeah. So, the IDP should be a pleasant process, which brings to one last thing that I want to mention, just because it doesn't fit anywhere else, which is after you've been in IDP for more than 3 years, and you still are missing hours in certain categories, there's this weird purgatory period, and we should come up with a name for it, but I'm going to call it the purgatory period, where you only need 1,200 hours in construction documents. You've racked up, let's say, 400 million hours in construction documents, and none of that is counting towards completing your IDP. It's a terrible phase. It's a terrible phase to be in. It's a terrible feeling to have when you know that you only need 8 hours left here, or worse, you need 30 hours here, and you're not getting it. And you start to regret not being more proactive early on. So that's why we've been stressing throughout this entire show, taking charge of your destiny, making sure that you're put into the categories that you need to be in order to complete IDP. Your sole goal is to rack up all the required hours in all the categories. That's all you should be worried about.
Good point. And keeping track of your hours, because you have to report them online through NCARB, through the website there. But what you're doing there is you're reporting your hours. We still recommend that you create some sort of Excel spreadsheet or something where you're tracking your hours and you're filling it in daily or weekly at the most, and really track your hours, because that's what it's all about. If you're tracking your hours, you're going to stay on point. If you stop tracking your hours, you're going to get lulled into, you're just going to get lulled into not taking enough action.
Well, that brings up a great point. You also want to design a way that fits into your normal workflow. So when I was doing IDP, there was no internet. It existed, but only for like nerds at MIT. So there was no internet in the office. Nobody had internet in the office. None of the computer there weren't even computers on every desk. That's how old I am. But so one of the ways that I found that worked with my workflow was that I made up this little blank form, in Excel or Word or something, and it was designed so that way I could easily write in the date for the week and then track what I did that week and see where I was. And then as a reference, I even had all the IDP categories down the side, just so I could see them at a glance. But I was essentially using this as my timesheet for billing the office, but also using it as a way to track my IDP. And at the end of it, I had 52 of these for every year that I worked. And it worked well because it was all manual. I printed them out. I did it by hand. It was always by my desk. And I just got in the habit of doing that. Nowadays, there's so many great online tools that maybe you're tracking your time by your iPhone. Maybe you're doing it on your computer. Maybe you just have a spreadsheet open all the time. Or maybe you can set yourself a little Outlook reminder, so at the end of every day, you just input what you did, make little notes by it, so later on you can compile your hours. However you do it, make sure it works for your workflow.
Outlook reminder? Who's using Outlook these days?
I don't know. Whatever the kids are using. But you and I use Evernote quite a bit. I think Evernote would be perfect for something like this. But I also, there's so many great tools out there that you can use. Use what you know will work. Don't make extra work for yourself. Don't make it into a chore, and don't make it for this extra stressor that, oh my God, I haven't filled in my my IDP hours for the last 2 months. Make it easy.
Yeah, make it easy. Don't make it a chore. And if it feels like a chore, I would just say adjust your attitude so you enjoy it. Because if you look at the kinds of experience you're going to get over those 3 years, it should be a really enjoyable experience, because you're going to see a broad range of what goes on in an architecture office, which should be exciting.
And a lot of people want to let's say exaggerate some of their experience. I don't want to say lie, but they want to exaggerate some of their experience and say that they did things they didn't. I could totally understand your argument of just wanting to get through IDP and finishing it, seeing it as just another requirement. But I can also very easily see how if you do IDP legitimately and you do it honestly, and you actually go through all the 4, the major product areas and the 17 categories, that it will only help you better prepare for the ARE exam. That you will go into that exam able to study better, able to kind of tie in your personal experience with what you're learning in the books, and you'll pass the test that much easier.
That's a good point as well, because I remember, working for Lee Hohenshaw, we did a lot of, corporate interiors, and I was concerned about the engineering systems, basically getting the structural coordination and all that stuff. Well, we got a couple of hotels, ground up 3-story wood frame construction hotels, like a Comfort Inn. I think we did like 3 or 4 hotels. But what was cool is that was after I was there for a few years. I was essentially the project architect on them, and I was doing all the drawing, I was doing all the coordination, and it was an amazing experience. And Lee would check the drawings every once in a while, but I was coordinating all the steel in the lobby, and it was just really cool. So even though I was worried about it, I mean, the opportunity just fell within my lap at that firm,
There were times when I remember vividly taking the ARE exam and getting questions, and immediately in my mind would pop in a project from 10 years earlier, that like one of the first projects I ever worked on. Not 10 years, I guess at that point it was only a few years earlier. But I was, here I am taking the exams in New Mexico, and I'm getting flashbacks to projects that I did in Philadelphia and New York earlier in my career. And it only made me retain the information better. So if you do IDP correctly, you're that much better prepared to pass the ARE.
Absolutely. And you'll be a better architect to be after the ARE. And if you take it seriously, you're going to have a good sense of, whether you want to go out on your own or not. Because some architects want to, some don't. Some are just happy to let somebody else worry about all that other stuff.
It's not for everybody.
No, it's not for everybody. It's definitely not for that. And that's another show topic. I guess lastly, before we go, Eric, I don't think we talked about your IDP experience.
My IDP experience was pretty straightforward. I was in a rush with myself. I really wanted to get kind of through it all and licensed early. I wanted to be the first licensed person in my graduating class. To me, I don't know why. I don't know what it means, but at the time that just seemed like an important milestone to me. And so I was already working while I was still in school, and so I had 2 years under my belt by the time I graduated. Now, not all of that was full-time work, so it didn't count towards 2 years of IDP, but because I worked part-time during school and full-time during summer break and stuff. But I had a lot of great experience, and I found not only did it contribute towards IDP, but it also helped me as a student, really. Plus, I had access to a blueprinter and code books and copy machines and sticky back. Do you remember sticky backs?
Right.
You know, it was all right when CAD was. It was 1992, so it was all when CAD was emerging. But my own IDP experience was I was keeping track of it as I was going, and I had this weekly sheet that I remember being real nerdy and making it look very pretty in Excel. But every day I would not just write down what project I worked on, but what I did on it, because I knew that I wouldn't remember. And so every 6 months when I would go to report my IDP experience, I would just go through these 26 sheets of paper and be able to put them in categories and make it easy. But I also found the importance of reporting stuff as you did it, because I spent 2 years working in New York. I didn't report it all during that time because I was quote unquote so busy, and and after the fact, I went to try to get credit for that experience. I didn't leave that firm on the best of terms. That's a long story, but my boss was upset at me leaving her, and so when I went back and asked her to validate my hours, she was a bit of a pain in the ass about it.
Yeah,
she did it, but she made me jump through a few hoops to do it, and it wasn't a pleasant experience for either of us, I'm sure. So all the more reason why you want to do it right then and there. Like I said, I have friends that their past, like in your case, their past boss passed away, and they weren't able to verify that experience. So now NCARB has reduced a lot of that. You only have a small window to document it, but for the most part, my IDP experience was great. As soon as I finished IDP and I got what they call the green letter, basically that I could test, and I was able to transmit it to New Mexico and then to California to get, so that way I could get licensed.
Alrighty, that is going to do it for today's episode at about 51 minutes here. My name is David Doucette, and on behalf of our co-host Eric Corey Freed, we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for listening to the ARE Podcast. Be sure to visit architectexamprep.com and check out our other podcast episodes, video tips, and the ARE blog. Remember